By the time Clara Whitcomb brought the sheep home, the whole county had already decided she had lost her mind. It was a gray morning in late October, the kind of Kentucky morning where fog sat low over the hollers and frost glittered along the fence wire. 3 old livestock trailers rattled down Whitcomb Road behind a dented blue pickup that used to belong to Clara's father. The truck had one working headlight, a cracked windshield, and a tailgate held shut with baling twine. Behind it came the sound that made every farmer along the road step out onto a porch, pause beside a mailbox, or slow a truck to a crawl. Bleating. Thin, ragged, desperate bleating. When Clara stopped at the front gate of Whitcomb Farm, 600 sheep stared out through the trailer slats. They were narrow in the ribs, dull in the eyes, and patched with dirty wool. Some limped. Some leaned against one another as if standing upright took all the strength they had left. Their coats were full of burrs and mud. Their legs looked too thin to carry them through a hard rain, much less a mountain winter. Clara climbed down from the truck without looking at the neighbors gathering by the road. She was 18 years old, small-shouldered, quiet, with her father's old canvas coat hanging loose on her frame and a wool cap pulled low over her brown hair. She opened the first trailer gate, set her jaw against the cold, and stepped aside as the first sheep stumbled down the ramp into a field most people in Miller County had stopped calling pasture years ago. That field was a mess of thistle, ragweed, broom sedge, and Sericea lespedeza. Cattle had refused most of it. The soil was bare in patches and hard as fired clay in others. The old hay ground beyond it had gone thin and yellow after 3 dry summers. The north fence sagged into the weeds. The barn roof had 3 rusted holes big enough to see daylight through. And Clara Whitcomb had spent the last money her family had on 600 starving sheep. A neighbor's pickup rolled past slowly, then stopped. Earl Pritchard, who farmed 200 acres across the ridge, leaned out his window and looked at the thin animals pouring into the field. "You know those sheep won't make December," he called. Clara kept one hand on the gate chain. "They might," she said. Earl laughed once, dry and sharp. "Your daddy would have known better." For a moment, Clara's face changed. Not much, just enough that the cold seemed to reach her eyes. Then she closed the trailer gate and turned back to the flock. She did not explain that the sheep had come cheap from a failed ranch in Missouri, or that most men had refused them because they looked too poor to survive. She did not explain the maps spread across her kitchen table, the faded grazing notes in her grandfather's handwriting, or the soil conservation pamphlets her father had kept in a cigar box above the refrigerator. She only stood beside the ruined fence, while 600 skinny sheep lowered their heads into a field everyone else had given up on. To the county, it looked like the last foolish act of a girl who was about to lose everything. And maybe they were right. Whitcomb Farm had not always looked that way. When Clara was little, her father used to lift her onto the hood of the tractor at dusk and point across the rolling acres like he was showing her a kingdom. 86 acres of pasture, hay ground, creek bottom, and worn red clay slopes had fed 3 generations of Whitcombs. Her grandfather had run cattle there. Her father had cut hay there. Clara had learned to read weather by the smell of the wind and soil by the way it crumbled in her palm. But the good years had thinned out. First came 2 bad summers when the rain missed their valley and fell everywhere else. Then fuel prices rose. Then hay prices jumped. Then the old John Deere began dying in the field every other week, coughing smoke, and refusing to turn over unless Clara knew exactly where to tap the starter with a wrench. Her father, Daniel Whitcomb, kept saying one more season would turn it around. Then the stroke came in March. He survived, but the farm changed overnight. His right hand trembled too badly to hold tools. His speech came slow. He could still sit at the kitchen table and point to ledgers, but he could not climb the tractor, could not mend fence, could not carry feed, could not walk the back 40 without stopping to breathe. At 18, Clara became the one who answered the bank calls. The letters came in clean white envelopes, with polite words and cruel numbers. Past due, final review, asset evaluation, payment schedule. The banker at First County Savings never said foreclosure the first time. He said restructuring, then he said liquidation risk. Then he looked over his glasses at Clara and her father and said the farm needed to show income before winter ended. Clara understood what that meant. If Whitcomb Farm could not make money, it would be sold. There were men in the county waiting for that. Men with newer trucks, bigger tractors, and sons old enough to expand. They called it helping when they offered to buy a few acres. They called it practical when they said Clara and her father could move into town. They said 86 acres was too much for a sick man and a quiet girl. Clara never answered them. She fixed what she could. She patched the barn roof with tin sheets pulled from an old shed. She tightened fence wire with pliers that had belonged to her grandfather. She cleaned out water troughs, hauled mineral blocks, sharpened mower blades, and kept records long after midnight while her father slept in the next room. Still, the farm kept sinking. The cattle were gone by summer, sold to pay medical bills and old feed debt. The hayfield barely covered the ground. The creek cut deeper into its banks every hard rain. The pastures grew weeds that neighbors called useless. By September, the land looked tired enough to lie down and not get back up. That was when Clara found the notebook. It was tucked behind coffee cans in the equipment shed, wrapped in a feed sack and tied with orange twine. The first pages belonged to her grandfather. The later ones were her father's. There were sketches of fence lines, frost dates, creek crossings, soil tests, and notes about winters Clara had been too young to remember. One page had a sentence underlined twice. Sheep can heal ground cattle won't touch, if you move them before they punish it. Clara read that line again and again. Then she started walking the farm differently. She noticed the weeds the cattle had refused still held green leaves after frost. She noticed the hardest ground was where large animals had stood too long, but the old sheep lot behind the barn, unused for years, had darker soil under the weeds. She noticed clover trying to come back along the lane where manure had washed and settled. She noticed how the creek bottom held moisture, but the hill pasture shed rain like a roof. She did not see a dead farm. She saw a farm out of balance. That was why she drove to Missouri. That was why she came home with 600 skinny sheep. The laughter started before she finished unloading them. At Ruthie's diner, men at the counter talked into their coffee cups like Clara was not sitting 2 booths away picking up a takeout order for her father. They said her daddy would have known better. They said sheep were fragile. They said winter would bury half of them. They said hungry animals would chew the farm down to dirt and leave nothing but bones and debt. At the feed store, the owner glanced at Clara's order for fencing supplies and asked whether she was building pens or a graveyard. A man by the mineral blocks said you could not save land with starving sheep. Another said, notebook ideas did not beat January ice. The banker heard about the sheep too. During Clara's next visit, Mr. Hanley folded his hands over her file and looked at her as if she were younger than 18. Miss Whitcomb, do you understand how serious this is? Clara sat straight in the chair across from him. Yes, sir. You bought distressed livestock with borrowed time. I bought livestock the land could feed. His mouth tightened. Land like yours does not feed 600 sheep through winter. Clara looked at the clean papers on his desk, then at the mud dried along the hem of her coat. Then I guess winter will tell us. Mr. Hanley leaned back slowly. It will, and if winter tells us the wrong thing, the bank will not be able to wait anymore. Clara nodded once, gathered her folder, and went home. She did not argue with the diner men. She did not defend herself in the feed store. She did not explain to the banker that sound decisions sometimes looked foolish from a paved office window. She went back to the pasture. For the first week, the work was ugly. The sheep were weaker than she had hoped. A few would not eat. One ewe collapsed near the lower gate, her legs folded beneath her like wet sticks. She had a black patch over one eye, and a torn ear tag with the number 47 faded almost white. Clara named her Junie because June was the month when everything on Whitcomb Farm used to look possible. That night, Clara carried Junie into the old lambing stall behind the barn. Rain ticked through the patched roof and gathered in a dented feed pan. Clara knelt in wet straw beside the ewe with a heat lamp, molasses water, and shaking hands. She rubbed the ewes' cold ears, cleaned mud from her nose, and held her head up until she swallowed. Twice, Clara thought Junie was gone. Twice, the ewe breathed again. By morning, Junie was still alive, but barely. 2 other sheep died before the weekend. Clara buried them at the edge of the cedar line, marked the losses in her notebook, and stood there longer than she meant to. The county would have called that proof. Clara called it the cost of starting too late. She divided the main field into narrow strips, using old step-in posts and electric wire patched from 3 different spools. She moved the flock in groups, never leaving them long enough to strip the soil bare. They ate ragweed seed heads, nipped young thistle, cleaned around fence lines, and worked through sericea the cattle had ignored. Their hooves pressed dead stems against the ground. Their manure fell in hundreds of small dark pellets, scattered better than any spreader Clara could not afford to fix. Every morning before sunrise, she walked the paddocks with a flashlight between her teeth, checking wire, water, and weak animals. Frost silvered her boots, her fingers cracked from cold and iodine. She learned which ewes pushed forward, which hung back, which lambs needed watching, which sections of pasture could take pressure, and which needed rest. Junie became her measure. If that black-eyed ewe could stand a little longer, Clara wrote it down. If she took one more mouthful of hay, Clara wrote it down. If she followed the flock 10 steps instead of 5, Clara wrote it down. In a sea of 600 animals, Junie was the one Clara searched for first every morning. At night, she sat at the kitchen table while her father slept nearby in his recliner, one hand curled stiffly against his chest. She opened his old notebook beside her own and compared dates. She read about stockpiled forage, frost-seeded clover, winter rotation, and the quiet patience of letting roots recover before asking them to feed again. The plan was not just to keep sheep alive. The plan was to use them as a living tool. They would graze what other livestock refused. They would trample carbon back into the soil. They would spread manure across ground too poor for purchased fertilizer. Their lighter bodies would disturb the surface without pounding it into brick. If Clara moved them carefully, the land might hold more water. If the land held more water, spring growth might return. If spring growth returned, Whitcomb Farm might have something to sell besides memories. It was a thin plan, but it was a plan. By November, the sheep began to change. Not all at once, not enough for a man driving past at 40 miles an hour to notice. But Clara noticed. The dull eyes brightened first. Then the coughing eased. Then the flock began to move with more purpose. When she opened a fresh strip, some of the ewes put on weight. Wool lifted cleaner from their backs after she trimmed burrs and treated skin sores. The weakest group still worried her, but the flock no longer looked like it was waiting to die. Junie, who had once folded to the ground like an empty sack, began standing at the gate when Clara came with feed. The land changed more slowly. Where sheep had grazed and moved on, the ground looked messy at first, flattened and spotted with manure. But after cold rains, those strips did not wash as badly as the bare slope above the road. The trampled stems formed a rough mat over exposed clay. In low places where runoff used to cut tiny channels, water spread instead of racing downhill. Clara wrote everything down: date, weather, paddock, grazing height, animal condition, soil surface, water flow. The neighbors kept laughing. In early December, Earl Pritchard stopped by the fence again while Clara was carrying a cracked water tub. "You still got time to sell what's left," he said, "before they become a disposal problem." Clara set the tub down. "They're not dead yet." Earl looked over the flock and snorted. "No, but winter's just getting started." He drove off in a clean white truck with heated seats, while Clara stood in the mud with both hands numb around a frozen gate latch. Alone, she was not always strong. One night, after freezing rain sealed the driveway in a skin of ice, Clara came inside soaked to the knees and found another bank envelope on the table. Her father had tried to open it with one hand and torn the corner badly. She read it twice while the wind pressed against the kitchen windows. 30 days. The bank wanted a payment plan, a livestock valuation, and proof of winter viability within 30 days. Clara sat down slowly. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming and the ping of sleet on the roof. Her boots left muddy water under the chair. Her hands smelled like lanolin, blood, and fence wire. In the next room, her father whispered her name, but she did not answer right away because she was afraid her voice would break. Daniel Whitcomb pushed himself up from the recliner. It took him a long time to cross the room. His cane knocked softly against the floorboards. His right hand trembled against his side, useless and curled. With his left hand, he reached for the old notebook on the table and dragged it toward him. Clara started to rise. "Don't," he said. It was only one word, rough and slow, but it stopped her. Her father turned the pages with clumsy fingers until he found a place near the back. His breath shook from the effort. He tapped one sentence with the knuckle of his left hand. Clara leaned over and read it. "Land remembers care longer than it remembers neglect." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Daniel pushed the notebook toward her. His voice came broken, but clear enough. "Keep going." Clara covered her mouth with one hand. Outside, the sleet turned to snow. Before dawn, she put her coat back on. Winter arrived hard after that. The first snow came early, wet and heavy, bending cedars low over the fence. Then the temperature dropped so fast, the ruts in the lane froze solid. A week later, another storm rolled over the county and left white drifts against barns and feed bunks. Then came the real cold, the kind that made metal bite skin and water lines groan in the dark. All across Miller County, farmers started counting hay bales with fear in their throats. The roads iced over. Delivery trucks ran late. Hay prices jumped overnight. Men who had laughed at Clara's sheep now stood in their barns calculating how many days they could feed cattle if the weather did not break. Some had grazed too close in the fall and had nothing left under the snow. Some had sold hay early for cash and now needed it back at twice the price. Calves bawled behind frozen gates. Cows nosed through snow and found only mud. At Whitcomb Farm, the county waited for disaster. They expected the skinny sheep to fold under the first real cold. They expected Clara to call for hay she could not afford. They expected buzzards in the cedar trees by January. For 2 days, it looked like they might be right. The worst storm came at night. Wind slammed down from the ridge and drove snow sideways through the gaps in the barn boards. The power flickered once, twice, then died. The heat lamp in Junie's stall went black. In the pasture, the flock bunched against the lower fence, pushed by wind and fear, their bodies packed too tight, near a drift that was rising by the hour. Clara heard them before she saw them. The sound was wrong. Not ordinary bleating, panic. She pulled on her coat over her nightshirt, grabbed a flashlight, and ran into a wall of snow. The beam showed almost nothing. Wind shoved ice into her eyes. The gate chain had frozen solid. She beat it loose with a hammer, fingers burning inside wet gloves, and stumbled toward the lower paddock. A section of electric netting had collapsed under ice. Several sheep had pushed into the corner. One lamb was pinned against the wire. Others milled in circles, confused by the dark and storm. If they stayed there, they would crush the weakest ones before morning. Clara tried to drag the fence upright, but the posts were frozen into the ground. She tried to lift the lamb, slipped, and went down hard on one knee. Pain shot up her leg. The flashlight rolled away and buried itself in snow, its beam pointing uselessly at the sky. For one long second, Clara stayed on her hands and knees in the storm. This was the moment the county had predicted. This was the mistake everyone had seen coming. 600 animals, one girl, a dead power line, a broken fence, a bank deadline, and a winter night too cold for mercy. Then a shape moved near the barn. Junie. The black-eyed ewe stepped out of the open stall, wool rimmed with snow, no longer the collapsed animal Clara had carried in her arms weeks before. She moved toward Clara's voice first, then toward the gap in the fence where Clara had been trying to lead the flock out. Clara saw her and forced herself up. She began calling low and steady, the way her father used to call cattle through fog. Junie came toward her, slow but certain. Then another ewe followed, then 10 more. Then the front of the flock shifted away from the corner and toward the open strip Clara had saved behind the barn. Clara used her own body as a gate. She waved her arms, shouted through the wind, and pushed the panicked sheep out of the trap, one bunch at a time. Twice she fell. Once a ewe knocked her shoulder into a post so hard her arm went numb. She lost one glove. She could no longer feel her toes. But the flock moved. By midnight, she had them in the sheltered strip behind the barn, where standing forage poked through wind-scoured snow and the old cedar line cut the worst of the gusts. She broke ice on the water trough with the hammer. She carried the pinned lamb inside her coat until it kicked again. She relit nothing because there was no power to relight. She simply stayed with them. Clara spent the rest of the night in the barn doorway with a wool blanket around her shoulders, watching steam rise from hundreds of backs in the dark. Junie stood near the front of the flock, black eye turned toward Clara, chewing slowly on grass everyone else had called worthless. At sunrise, Whitcomb Farm was still there. The storm did not end the winter. It sharpened it. Another week of cold followed. Then a thaw came too fast, bringing 3 days of rain over frozen ground. Water rushed down neighboring slopes in brown sheets. Ditches filled with mud. A section of county road washed out near the church. Farmers watched their lots turn to soup and their haystacks shrink to nothing. But on Whitcomb Farm, the grazed and rested strips slowed the runoff. Trampled weeds and manure-rich soil caught water instead of shedding it. The creek rose, but its banks held where Clara had kept the flock off the weakest edges and let grass stand tall. The stockpiled strips were not lush, but they were enough. Beneath snow and ice, the sheep kept finding feed, not by magic, by inches, by planning, by every small strip Clara had saved when people said she was wasting time. She still fed hay, but not nearly as much as everyone expected. The flock held, then it gained. By the second week of January, Clara could see it from the porch. The sheep moved differently, full-bodied and sure-footed, their wool thicker, their heads lifting when she came with feed. The ewes that had looked hollow in October now carried weight across their backs. The lambs that had worried her began bouncing stiff-legged through snow like sparks of life against a white field, and Junie, the ewe that should have died the first week, now walked at the front whenever Clara opened a new strip. The land held too. The county agent came out after the thaw because he had heard conflicting stories. Some said Clara was ruining the place. Others said her sheep looked better than half the cattle in the county. He parked by the barn on a bright, bitter morning and walked the fields with a clipboard. Clara said little. She showed him the rotation map. She showed him the notebook. She showed him the strips grazed in October and rested since November. She knelt, broke the crust of soil with a pocket knife, and turned up a small crumble of earth darker than the clay around it. The county agent did not praise her right away. He just stopped talking. That silence reached town before his truck did. By late January, farmers who had laughed began slowing down again in front of Whitcomb Farm, but now they were not laughing. They watched the flock spread across the snow-dusted pasture in calm gray waves. They watched Clara move wire with practiced hands. They saw that the field they had called dead was not bare dirt. It was covered. It was resting. It was holding. The bank deadline came on a Friday. Clara drove into town in her father's blue pickup with mud on the tires and a folder on the seat beside her. Inside the folder were weight records, veterinary notes, grazing maps, photographs, and an offer from a regional buyer for a portion of the now recovered flock. There was also a smaller check from a wool pool and a signed agreement from a neighbor who wanted to rent breeding rams in spring. Mr. Hanley opened the folder expecting excuses. He found numbers. Not miracle numbers, not rich numbers, but real ones, enough to make the overdue payment, enough to show income, enough to prove that Whitcomb Farm was not dead. Clara placed the check on his desk. Mr. Hanley looked from the check to her face. "So Winter told us," he said quietly. Clara stood in the same coat she had worn the first day the sheep came home. "Yes, sir," she said. "It did." For the first time since her father's stroke, the banker had nothing careful left to say. Spring did not come all at once. It came in small signs: a softer wind, a longer evening, snow shrinking from fence posts, water moving clear in the ditch instead of brown. Then, one morning in March, Clara walked the first pasture and saw green pushing through the trampled mat of last year's weeds: clover. Not everywhere, not thick yet, but there. She crouched in the cold and touched the leaves with 2 fingers. By April, the change was visible from the road. Whitcomb Farm greened earlier than the neighboring fields. The worst thistle patches were thinner. The bare clay slopes had cover. The sheep moved through rotating paddocks like they belonged there. No longer a rescue flock, no longer a joke, but the engine of the farm's recovery. People began stopping by. The feed store owner asked what mineral mix she had settled on. The man who said she would be burying half the flock asked whether she might sell a few ewes. A cattle farmer from 2 roads over stood by the fence for almost an hour while Clara explained, quietly and without pride, how long she let each strip rest. Earl Pritchard came last. He parked by the gate on a warm afternoon and stood with both hands in his jacket pockets. Clara was moving fence. Junie grazed a few yards behind her, round-bodied now, her black eye bright in the sun. Earl looked at the ewe, then at the field. "That one from the first trailer?" he asked. Clara clipped the wire to a post. "Yes." He nodded slowly. For once he did not laugh. "Guess your daddy taught you something after all." Clara looked across the pasture before answering. "He did," she said, "but the land taught me the rest." Earl had no reply to that. The banker came once too, wearing clean boots that gathered red mud around the soles. He looked across the pasture, then toward the old farmhouse, then back at Clara. He said the farm looked good. Clara only nodded. The moment she remembered most came a week later, when her father asked to be helped onto the porch. He moved slowly with his cane, his face pale from months indoors, but his eyes sharpened when he saw the flock grazing the lower field. The evening sun lay gold across the backs of the sheep. Beyond them, the pasture rolled green toward the creek. Junie stood near the front fence, chewing calmly, the same ewe Clara had once held upright in the dark. For a long time, Daniel said nothing. Then his left hand found Clara's sleeve and held on. That was enough. By the end of the year, Whitcomb Farm had not become rich, but it had become alive again. Clara sold enough lambs to make the next bank payment early. She kept the strongest ewes. She repaired the north fence properly. She reseeded the worst slopes with clover and orchard grass. She turned the old cattle barn into a working sheep shed and painted the name Whitcomb across the door in white letters. The same road that had carried laughter past her gate now carried trucks that slowed out of respect. No one in Miller County said the sheep had ruined the farm anymore. They said Clara had seen something they had missed. But Clara knew the truth was quieter than that. She had not saved the farm with one lucky idea. She had saved it by watching the land when no one else thought it was worth watching. She had saved it by reading the notes of men who had loved that soil before her. She had saved it by getting up in the dark, moving fence in the cold, burying her losses, keeping records, and trusting that exhausted ground could still answer care. The 600 skinny sheep had arrived like a warning. They became the reason Whitcomb Farm survived. And years later, when neighbors brought their own sons and daughters to Clara's fence line to learn how a dying pasture came back, she would open her father's old notebook to the page that started it all. Sheep can heal ground cattle won't touch if you move them before they punish it. Then she would turn to a fresh page in her own handwriting, look out over the green pasture, and add what Winter had taught her. A farm is not finished just because everyone else has stopped believing in it.